To this day, I remember this day with all its tiny details as if it happened yesterday, even though more than 4 years have passed since that night, and perhaps that is because my whole life split into afterwards. A half before I knew this woman, and a half after I saw her with my own eyes, and heard her voice while she was saying the names of people who were still alive and walking among us. Very normally. And the terrifying thing is that all those names actually died afterward in the same order that left her mouth while she was sitting among the women crying. My name is Hassan, a middle school history teacher, living in a small village near Minya and our village. Our village is the kind where everyone knows each other by name and by their father's and grandfather's name. And if someone was absent for 2 or 3 days, people would start asking about them and looking around to see where they had gone. That's why any news of a death would be known throughout the entire village before the body reached the cemetery. The story began on the day of Hajj Abdel Salam's death. Hajj Abdel Salam was an old man over 70, owned a lot of land, and was loved by most people, and when he died, a natural death, no one was surprised, because the man had been ill for a long time, and everyone expected God to grant him rest soon. That day I went to the funeral immediately after school. It was around the afternoon at the time. The whole street was full of cars and people were going in and out. The women were gathered inside Hajj Abdel Salam's house, and the men were sitting outside under the tent. Everything was very normal, until I heard the sound of wailing. At first I didn't think much of it because in any funeral in Upper Egypt there have to be women mourning, crying, and raising their voices. But this sound was a little different. It was older, coarser, and had a strange tone. It felt like its owner had come from another time. I stayed sitting with the men for a while, then I went inside the house to drink water. And that was when I saw her for the first time. She was sitting at the back of the room among the women. She was wearing a very old black abaya that looked like a traditional shawl. Her face was half covered, and only her eyes were visible. The strange thing was that no one was looking at her. Her presence was normal, as if she were one of the household. But I am 1,000,000% sure that I had never seen her before in the village. I kept looking at her, trying to remember who she belonged to. And suddenly she began to wail. She said in a long, husky voice, "Oh, Abdessalam, my son, my dear light of my eyes. What a loss you are, Abdessalam. What a loss you are, Sayed. What a loss you are, Fatih. What a loss you are, Goma." As soon as she said that, I felt something strange. Hajj Abdel Salam was the one who died. But Sayed, Fatih, and Goma were people who were still alive, and I knew them personally. One is a carpenter, the second is a bakery owner, and the third is a farmer on land near the canal. So naturally, I thought she was an old woman who had become senile. But what caught my attention more was that as soon as she said those names, a few women looked at each other quickly, and then they went quiet. It was as if it wasn't the first time this had happened. In the name of God and with God's blessing, let us begin the episode. In the name of God, this episode is a new story, a new installment in our series of listener experiences and tales, your tales. Let's start today's episode by saying, in the name of God. I left the house feeling that the matter was a bit strange, but 2 days later, I got busy with work and forgot the whole story until Friday, the day I woke up to the sound of screaming coming from the end of the street. I ran out along with the people. I found Sayed, the carpenter's house, filled with people. Sayed died suddenly, just like that, while he was sleeping. The doctor said it was a heart attack and people were immediately convinced, but I remembered his name. I remembered the mourner. I remembered that she had said it days before he passed away. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, and that the whole town has dozens of names, so it's natural for one of them to be right. But exactly a week later, Fatih, the owner of the bakery, died. He died returning from the market. He collapsed on the ground all at once without any warning. And here, for the first time, I began to feel that the matter was more than just a coincidence. The two of them died in the exact order of the names the woman had said. Abdel Salam, then Saeed, then Fathi, and one named, just one, Guma'ah. From that day on, I started to notice something terrifying. Every time I met Goma in the street, it was clear that he too had heard what was said about him. Every day his appearance looked worse than the day before. He stopped leaving the house except for rarely. He started leaving his land early and coming back. He even stopped going to the dawn prayer. The man was waiting for something, or waiting for someone. And the strangest thing of all was that people in town started whispering about this woman. But no one would mention her name. No one knew her house. And no one knew where she came from. All they would say was just one sentence. If you see her at a funeral, don't listen to what she says. And don't listen to whom she names. For the first time in my life, I felt there was an old secret hidden beneath the dust of the entire town. A secret people knew, but no one had the courage to speak about out loud. One night, about 2 weeks later, while I was returning from a private tutoring session a bit late, I saw something that made sleep flee from my eyes for months. For months, I saw the mourner, walking alone on the street leading to the graveyard, even though there wasn't any funeral and no one had died that day. She was talking to herself, repeating one name, the same name, over and over. Until she got close to me to the point that I heard it clearly. And when I heard it, I felt my legs freeze in place, because the name she kept repeating the whole way was my own name. I don't remember how my legs carried me from in front of the street that led to the graveyard all the way to our front door. But I remember well that the path I used to take every day without thinking suddenly became long, strange, and fuller of darkness than normal. It was as if the whole town agreed to go silent the moment that old woman uttered my name. Her voice kept following me in my ears, with the same slow tone that had weeping without tears, as she kept saying, Hassan, oh Hassan, Hassan, Hassan. It was as if she wasn't calling out to me, but as if she was testing the name on her tongue before saying it at a funeral in front of everyone. I entered the house, locked the door behind me, and stood in the hallway for a while, trying to listen if there were any footsteps behind the door. But there was nothing except the sound of my own breathing in the old fan in my mother's room. It was humming the same buzz that I had never feared before tonight. Even though the house was lit and people were sleeping inside, I felt that something had come in with me. Something not standing in front of me, but leaving its scent in the air. My mother woke up when she heard the door. She came out of her room, pulling her shawl over her shoulder. She asked me why I came back with that look on my face. I tried to say it was nothing, and that the lesson just finished late. But my voice sounded clearly unnatural. She kept looking at me for a while, the way only mothers know how to look. Then she spoke quietly as she said to me, If you see something in town after midnight, don't talk about it until morning. Because talking at night makes the thing you saw find its way to you. That sentence made me look at her quickly, because she said it as if she knew what happened to me wasn't just a late walk. When I asked her what she meant, her face changed for a brief moment. She went back to saying she was just talking nonsense and old superstitions. But I knew my mother well. When my mother avoids a question like that, it means the question touched something she is afraid to remember. I went into my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I kept staring at the closed window, trying to sort out what happened since Hajj Abdel Salam's funeral. Because the mourner at the funeral said the names of Sayed, Fatih, and Goma amidst her wailing. And after that, Sayed died, and Fatih died. And Goma, he's still alive, but he's become like someone waiting for a sentence to be carried out. And now I heard her on the road to the cemetery repeating my name alone. And that means either I have started to go crazy, or my turn has really drawn near. Sleep that night wasn't sleep, it was a fragmented coma between waking and being startled. Every time I drifted off, her voice appeared from the end of the dream. Each time I saw myself standing at a big funeral, all the women dressed in black, the mourner sitting in the center covering her face, and every time I reached out my hands to remove the shroud from her, all the women would look at me at once, as if the funeral wasn't for the dead, but for the one whose turn was next. I woke up early contre debit. I washed my face several times, trying to get back to myself. But as soon as I went out to the street, I felt the whole town was looking at me, not in the literal sense, but the feeling you get when you are carrying a secret and you meet many ordinary people. You think they can see it and it's written on your face specifically. Both. When I met Goma at the bakery, he was standing to buy bread with a trembling hand, his face pale, as if he hadn't slept for days. I approached him and greeted him, but he grabbed my hand with strange strength and said in a low voice, "You heard her last night." At that moment, I felt my heart stop for a second, because I hadn't told anyone, and when I asked him how he knew, he looked around as if he were afraid someone might hear. Then he told me, "When that woman starts wandering around the graveyard before dawn, it means the door's been opened for the name on her tongue." And I heard my own name from her 2 days before Fatih died. And since then, I've been waiting for her to come and take it. I tried to calm him down, telling this talk made no sense, and that what happened with Sayed and Fatih could just be a coincidence. But he let out a small laugh, one that held no joy at all. Then he said to me, "Coincidence doesn't know the order of the names, my son. This town holds something older than the houses we live in. And there are so many people who know the story, but they choose to stay silent, because whoever asks too many questions gets their name called sooner." One. As he said this, his eyes showed that he had moved past the stage of fear into the stage of surrender. And that was the first time I felt I wasn't just afraid for myself. I began to fear the thought that a person could live out their final days knowing they are few, waiting for an old woman's voice to cut off the last bit of hope. Before I left, Guma grabbed my arm and told me then, "If you want to know who this woman is, ask Sit Badriya." Who is this Sit Badriya? The last one in town who remembers the old funeral. The funeral where the whaler first appeared. She lives by the canal, in a low house with a palm front roof, and no one goes to her except those who are already in deep trouble. All day at school, I couldn't see the kids in front of me. I was standing there explaining a lesson about the French campaign and the Mamluks and memorized facts, but my ears were hearing something else entirely. Hearing that woman's voice as she drew out my name at the end, as if she were making a lament out of it. And every time one of the boys raised his hand or laughed, I felt like I was far from the normal world. Like I was standing in one place and everyone else was in another. After the afternoon prayer, I went towards Sit Padria's house. The houses are sparse there. They look older than the rest of the town, like houses of people who decided to stay away, far from the crowd and the gossip. When I reached her house, I found it was indeed low and old, its wooden door eaten away. And above the door was an old horseshoe and a large blue bead hanging by a black thread. I knocked twice. After a while, I heard an old woman's voice from inside saying, "Come in, Hassan, without me," asking myself how she knew my name. Because at that moment I was ready to believe anything. I opened the door and entered. I found her sitting on an old reed mat beside a small window. A woman likely over 90 years old, but her eyes were terrifyingly alert. It was only her body that had aged, but her spirit and eyes were still young, just as they were before. I sat before her, and before I could speak, she said, "Goma sent you." Then she was silent for a long time, looking into my face. When the whaler speaks a man's name at a funeral, it means his name has been linked to the water. And when she says the name alone on the road to the graveyard, it means he is the next one on the list. Missed. And the worst thing one can do in this case is to try and hide, aid. The whaler isn't looking for the body. The whaler is looking for the voice that will be called out upon. I asked her and said to her, "Who is she?" She smiled a small smile and said, "Back then her name was Rhea, and she was a real mourner. A woman who made a living from weeping for the dead. In a time when people thought it was just a job like any other, but one night she mourned the wrong people. People who were still alive. And after that, they died. Since that day, the village realized that her face was no longer the face of that woman. There was something else entirely living inside her." I felt a chill running down my spine. What do you mean she was a real woman? Is she alive then, or is she dead, or what? Sid Badria looked toward the window and said then, "Raya died? More than 50 years ago. They buried her in a grave outside, all alone, the edge of the cemetery. Because people were afraid to bury her among them back then. But mourning is not buried, Hassan. A voice that rises once from beneath the earth keeps circling until it finds someone to hear it." I wanted to ask her why she's appearing now, but she beat me to it and said, "Every few years the village forgets. So she appears to remind them. And every time she takes names, and those names are linked to a funeral, one. And the funeral that started Hajj Abdus Salam's is no ordinary funeral. Abdus Salam was the last, one of the men who buried Raya far from the people's graves. And when he died, the door opened once, again." This sentence made everything inside me go haywire. The matter was linked to an ancient history bigger than just coincidences. So I asked her, "Is there a way to stop her?" She looked at me with eyes devoid of any mercy and said, "When the name is called out, amidst the mourning, it can be saved. But when it is called out alone, on the way to the cemetery, it is difficult, my son." "And whoever had his name called must enter the cemetery before dawn and listen to the mourning in full without answering. And if he answers her, even with a single word, he is the one who opened the door to his grave with his own hand." I returned from her place feeling that the canal, the crops, and the houses were all silent in a suspicious way. Every step I took, I kept remembering her words about how this mourner wasn't looking for a body, but for a voice. And that made me avoid speaking even to anyone I met on the road. My own voice had become something I had to hide. I reached the middle of the village a little before sunset, and there I found the people gathered in front of Goma's house, and the same wailing I had come to know was coming from inside. But this time I didn't need anyone to tell me who had died, because I knew before I saw. I knew from the people's faces, and from the way each one of them would look at the ground quickly when they saw me. and from the woman who caught sight of me and said, "God protect us," as if she had seen the next dead man standing on his feet. Goma died. He fell in his land next to the canal before the afternoon, and those who saw him said he was holding his ears with both hands, screaming, saying he wouldn't answer, no matter how much she called. And after that he fell to the ground all at once. His face was twisted in horror, as if he had heard something no one else had heard. I stood among the people, feeling as though the air had been sucked out from around me. The last name at Hajj Abd Salam's funeral was finished, and the order was closed, which means any new name after it wouldn't be part of the old funeral. It would be the start of a new one. And I knew very well that the new name was spoken yesterday at the cemetery. I entered Goma's house against my will. I don't know why. Maybe to make sure there wasn't a mourner. Maybe to prove to myself that the old woman wouldn't appear to me at every death. But as soon as I entered, I heard the same raspy voice from the back room. Her voice as she mourned for Goma. The women around her were silent, as if they didn't hear what I was hearing. She was sitting there, in the same black abaya or headscarf, with the same eyes. But this time, when she raised her face toward the door, she looked directly at us and smiled. A small smile, as if she were expecting me. Then she began to wail. "Oh, Goma, my son, my dear, you have left the house empty. Woe unto you, Goma! Woe unto you, Hassan! Woe unto you, Hassan! Woe unto you, Hassan! Woe unto you, Hassan! Ipasan!" Oh. All the women fell silent, and suddenly no sound remained in the room but her voice. And in that moment, I felt like my name wasn't just spoken. I felt like I was buried. After hearing my name emerging from the middle of the morning at Goma's funeral like that, I felt my mind decided to shut itself off for a while to be able to grasp what was happening. I stayed standing among the people, looking toward the old woman as she sat among the women. But strangely, after she said my name, she went back to crying for Goma very normally, as if she hadn't said anything at all. The thing that bothered me most of the time was that none of those present were surprised. Not one of the women raised her head. No one asked who Hassan was, and no one even looked my way. It was as if what happened was something recurring, and people learned to deal with it in only one way: silence. Silence. I left the house of mourning, feeling that the whole town was looking at me, even if no one was actually looking. And this feeling stayed with me. Every time I met someone in the street, I tried to convince myself that they were normal and didn't know anything. But inside me, there was a voice saying that everyone knew, and I was the last to understand. And from then on, I began to watch. Not her. No, I began to watch the people. I discovered that whenever someone mentioned her, in front of an elderly person, the man or woman would change the subject immediately. And whenever someone young asked about her, they would be told forget about that talk. And this indicated that this matter was much older than my generation. A week passed, then a second, and nothing happened. And for the first time, I began to breathe a little. I said, perhaps Ms. Bedrea made a mistake. Perhaps everything that is happening is just coincidences. Perhaps fear has played with people's minds for many long years, until they began to believe anything. But the night that changed everything was after about a month. I was coming back from a lesson late. I passed by the only coffee shop that stays open after dinner, and I found the men gathered in a strange way. They weren't laughing, watching a match, or even speaking loudly. They were all silent. And as soon as I approached them, I felt they went quiet. It's a feeling I've never liked. The feeling that a conversation is happening, and when you arrive, it stops all of a sudden. I sat with Uncle Jabber, the owner of the shop, and he also stayed silent for a while. Then he looked at me and asked a strange question. How many times have you seen her? Who is she? He replied to me without mentioning her name. He was silent for a bit, and then he told something no one had ever told me before. About 35 years ago, there was another teacher from the town named Ibrahim, a respectful and educated man. And he had an experience just like what is happening to you. He heard his name at a funeral. After that, he kept living for months as usual. But instead of dying, he disappeared. What do you mean, disappeared? He left one morning for school and never came back. Did they look for him, or what did they do? They reported it, but no one knew anything about him. This sentence kept spinning in my head while I was going home. This was the first time I had heard this story. A story that left the circle of death and entered a wider circle. Some people died and some disappeared. And in both cases, the mourner was there. Since that day, I started looking into this story more deeply. I went to the old mosque and asked the muezzin, and I also asked the gravedigger. I asked elderly people, and most of them refused to talk. But only one agreed. Hashahata, the oldest man in town, was nearing 90 years old. When I asked him about the mourner, he stayed silent for a very long time. And then he spoke and said, "Do you think people back then were hiding it?" "No, but why didn't anyone try to follow her?" Because truly, everything I heard about the mourner was from people who saw her, or people who heard her voice. But no one ever said they knew where she lived or even where she goes after the funeral. Because those who tried didn't return. This was the first time I really felt there was a missing part of the story. A part no one talks about. And from here, I made a very stupid decision. Or perhaps it was the only decision that could be taken, which was to follow her. I waited a week, 2, 3, until the news came. An elder from the town had died. And that night, I went to the funeral. And my only concern was to see her. And she truly appeared. The same black shawl, the same way of sitting, and the same voice. But this time, I wasn't focused on her words. I was focused on her. After about an hour of wailing, she got up. Very calmly, she left, and I followed her. From afar, the town was empty, and the woman was walking extremely slowly. She didn't turn around or look back, as if she knew the way very well. I kept walking behind her for more than half an hour, until she passed the last houses of the town and headed toward the cemetery. My heart was pounding in a terrifying way, but for me, curiosity was stronger. I kept going, and she kept going, until she reached the end of the cemetery. And there the thing happened that changed my perspective on everything that came before. The woman simply vanished. She didn't enter a grave, walk another way, or even hide. I was seeing her with my own eyes, and then she disappeared. She just wasn't there anymore. I stood where I was, stunned, and I started walking around the place, searching and looking until I spotted something very small and old. Dilapidated, almost broken headstone with the name Raya written on it. Eat. I stood looking at the name for a long time, and I looked around it and found dozens of old extinguished candles, pieces of black cloth, and things people had left behind. It was as if this place had been visited for years. At that moment I heard someone's voice behind me. An old woman's voice. A woman speaking and saying, "You didn't find her, right?" I turned quickly. It was Mrs. Bedrea standing behind me. I asked her then, how did you know the place, and how? I knew you would come, just as others came before you. She sat beside me by the grave, and only then did she say the one truth I became convinced of. Maybe, my son, it's Raya, and maybe not. No one knows, my son. Maybe a woman really died. Maybe people are the ones who made a story out of it. Maybe it's fear that kills people, and maybe all this is just coincidences that have been going on for 50 years. But one thing is certain. Everyone who heard their name lived the rest of their lives in fear. After those words, I went back to my house. I stopped looking or asking, and I continued my life. Normally, I moved out of the town after 2 years, got married, had children, lived, and long years passed without anything happening until I was convinced that the whole thing was over, or perhaps it never existed at all. Until about 6 months ago, I returned to the town to attend the funeral of a relative. The first funeral I had attended there in years. I entered the hall and sat down. The people around me had changed, the faces had changed. But in the last row was sitting the same black shawl, the same posture, and the same silence. It was as if 50 years had passed for her in a single day. I kept looking in her direction, but she didn't raise her face. She didn't look at me, nor did she say my name. But as I was leaving the funeral, I heard the voice of a woman asking another, "Who is that woman?" I don't know. It's my first time seeing her. And only then did that same old feeling return. The feeling that says some stories don't need proof to stay alive. It's enough that people keep telling them and fearing them, and waiting for the next name. And I wonder, while you are listening to this story, did you hear? You're not. And if you hear your name in a few days, what will you do? And so today's episode comes to an end, and today's story and experience. You have the right, my friend, to believe or disbelieve all or part of the episode. For these are the listeners' experiences, your stories. Writer Azaldin Abdel Fattah for writing the episode in the radio format that you have just heard. I thank the writer Lisa Zaglo for her preparation for every episode of the General Horror Program. Finally, I thank Mustafa Masri for the sound effects and music. But I thank you all for your kind listening. If you are new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and join us, and turn on the notification bell to receive all new updates. But if you're someone who likes to support me, please don't forget to like, comment, and share. Thank you very much. You've been with Mohammed Gawali and the General Horror Program. Peace be upon you.